Right now, there are more than 8 billion of us. We've covered nearly every landmass on Earth. We've been to the bottom of the ocean and the surface of the moon. It's easy to assume humanity was always destined to take over the planet. But rewind the clock roughly 900,000 years, and the story looks completely different. According to a landmark genetic study, our ancestors weren't thriving. They were vanishing. At one point, the entire breeding population of early humans may have dropped to somewhere around 1,280 individuals. Fewer people than fit in a single high school. And that wasn't a brief dip. It lasted for more than 100,000 years. If that number is accurate, humanity came astonishingly close to never existing at all. One bad drought, one disease, one string of unlucky seasons, and there is no you, no me, no 8 billion people. Just a dead branch on the evolutionary tree. So how do scientists know this happened? Hundreds of thousands of years before a single written word, before agriculture, before most of the fossils we normally rely on. And if we really did almost disappear, what dragged us back from the edge? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how researchers found a near-extinction event buried inside your own DNA, and why that event may have quietly shaped who we are today. Let's get into it. Here's the problem scientists were trying to solve. For decades, there's been a strange, stubborn gap in the human fossil record, roughly between 950,000 and 650,000 years ago. Fossils from this window are frustratingly rare, both in Africa and across Eurasia. Not missing entirely, but thin, patchy. The kind of gap that makes researchers suspicious. Something happened. Without being able to prove exactly what, fossils, though, only tell you where bones happen to survive and get discovered. They don't tell you how many people were alive at any given moment. For that, researchers turned to a completely different kind of evidence, the genome of every person living today. Here's the basic logic. Every one of us carries small genetic variations, tiny differences scattered across our DNA. If you trace any one of those variations backward through generations, it eventually merges with other versions of the same gene, all converging on a single shared ancestor. The timing and pattern of that merging depends heavily on population size. Large populations preserve enormous genetic diversity. Small populations bottleneck that diversity down hard. In 2023, a team of researchers built a new statistical tool for reading this pattern, called FitCoal, short for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent Process. Older methods were decent at spotting long, gradual population changes, but they tended to miss short, severe crashes. FitCoal was specifically designed to catch those sudden collapses. The team ran it against the genomes of more than 3,000 people from populations across the globe. And the result was jarring. Somewhere between about 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the effective breeding population of our ancestors appears to have collapsed from around 98,000 individuals down to roughly 1,280, and stayed there for about 117,000 years before finally recovering. By the researchers' estimate, close to 99% of the ancestral population may have been lost. It's worth pausing on that number for a second, because 1,280 breeding individuals doesn't necessarily mean the entire species was reduced to a tiny village you could count on your fingers. It refers to something geneticists call effective population size. Essentially, the number of individuals who actually passed their genes forward to the next generation. The real, physical headcount could plausibly have been somewhat higher. Still, even accounting for that, this represents an extraordinarily narrow genetic bottleneck, one severe enough to erase an estimated 2/3 of our species' genetic diversity in a single stretch of deep time. So what could cause a crash like that? The timing lines up with a major shift in Earth's climate, right around the transition from the early to the middle Pleistocene. Ice ages were intensifying, sea levels were dropping. In parts of Africa, this period likely brought long, punishing droughts and food sources that were far less reliable than what earlier hominins had relied on. A population already stretched thin by a changing world would have been extremely vulnerable to exactly this kind of collapse. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The researchers noticed that this narrow window of survivors overlaps almost precisely with a strange genetic event: the origin of human chromosome 2. Every other great ape, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, carries 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans carry 23. Our chromosome 2 appears to be the fusion of two separate ancestral chromosomes into one. Some of the researchers behind this study argue that this fusion may have taken hold specifically because the population was so small during the bottleneck. In a tiny, isolated group, an unusual genetic trait like a chromosome fusion has a much higher chance of spreading through the whole population purely by chance than it would in a large, diverse one. In other words, the same crisis that nearly wiped us out may have also pushed through one of the genetic changes that helped define our species going forward. Think about what surviving that stretch would have actually required. A population that's small, spread thin across shrinking, unpredictable habitats, wasn't just unlucky. It was living on a knife's edge for over 1,000 generations straight. Every drought, every failed hunting season, every outbreak of disease had the potential to push the numbers from precarious to zero. There was no buffer, no neighboring group of 10,000 people a few valleys over to absorb the shock or replenish the gene pool. Whatever behavioral flexibility, cooperation, and sheer environmental luck kept that population above the extinction line, it had to keep working, uninterrupted, for well over 100,000 years. Miss once, and there's nothing left to write a genetic record in the first place. It also means the eventual recovery is just as remarkable as the crash itself. Somewhere around 813,000 years ago, the population climbed back out of that narrow trough and began expanding again, eventually spreading and diversifying into the ancestors of Homo heidelbergensis, and later, the separate lineages that would become Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. A handful of researchers have pointed out that the very fossils we do have from Africa in this period, sparse as they are, belong to species that could plausibly represent the descendants of exactly this recovering population. Now, before this starts sounding like settled science, it's important to say clearly, not everyone in the field is convinced. When this study was published, several population geneticists who weren't involved in the research pushed back hard. Some argued that estimating population sizes from nearly 1 million years ago is an extraordinarily difficult statistical problem, and that a new method producing a dramatic result nobody else had detected deserved real scrutiny before being treated as fact. A follow-up study published the next year went further, suggesting the bottleneck signal might actually be a statistical artifact, a pattern created by assumptions baked into the model, rather than a genuine population crash. To be clear, almost no one is arguing that our ancestors definitely didn't go through hard times during this period. Difficult stretches, even severe ones, are broadly plausible given what we know about the climate back then. The disagreement is narrower and more technical. Whether this specific method, at this specific moment in deep time, can really pin the population down to a number as precise and dramatic as 1,280, given that older, well-tested methods never picked up a signal this extreme in the same data. That's the kind of debate that tends to play out over years, not headlines, as more evidence, more genomes, and better methods get applied to the same question. Either way, the broader picture is genuinely worth sitting with. If a bottleneck of anything close to this scale really happened, it means the ancestors of every single human alive today, every culture, every language, every person you've ever met, all trace back through an almost impossibly narrow genetic funnel, not thousands of thriving communities spread across a continent. possibly closer to a single fragile population, clinging on through a period of extreme instability, at a moment in history when extinction may have been sitting far closer than survival. And if they hadn't made it through, hadn't found the right water source, hadn't adapted their behavior fast enough, hadn't simply gotten lucky, there's no guarantee the story continues the way it did. No Homo sapiens branching off later. No agriculture, no cities, no science capable of eventually looking backward far enough to notice any of this happened in the first place. So the next time being human feels like a given, like an outcome that was somehow inevitable. It's worth remembering this. For well over 100,000 years, deep in our past, our entire lineage may have been down to a population you could fit into a single school gymnasium. Everything after that point, every person who has ever lived since, exists because that small, struggling group of ancestors didn't quite disappear. So here's a question worth sitting with. If our entire species really did squeeze through a bottleneck that narrow, does that make humanity feel more fragile to you or more resilient? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll pin my favorite.